It began the way these confrontations usually do now, not with a policy memo or a closed-door briefing, but with a burst of language designed to travel faster than context ever could. Donald Trump, speaking in his familiar register of urgency and confrontation, framed the protests against ICE in Minnesota as something darker than dissent, choosing words that implied coordination rather than spontaneity. He described the demonstrators as professionals, not citizens, a rhetorical move that immediately shifts the conversation from grievance to threat. Once that frame is set, everything that follows starts to feel less like a debate over immigration enforcement and more like a test of authority. And tests of authority are Trump's preferred arena. In that moment, Minnesota stopped being a state and became a stage. The protests themselves, complex and varied as they were, faded into the background as the focus snapped to who was supposedly in control. Trump's comments didn't linger on what the protesters were asking for, or why, but on who he suggested was enabling them. By naming political leaders in Minnesota, he effectively pulled the state's Democratic leadership into a national confrontation. It was no longer about crowds in the street, but about power lines between Washington and St. Paul. The suggestion that state leaders could or should be arrested or expelled landed like a thunderclap, even for a political climate accustomed to lightning. Some heard it as bluster, another example of Trump's habit of escalating language to dominate the news cycle. Others heard something more deliberate, a signal to his base that resistance would be met not with negotiation, but with forceful rhetoric. What mattered wasn't whether such outcomes were realistic, but that the words themselves reset expectations. Once the idea is spoken, it exists, regardless of feasibility. For Trump's supporters, the framing fit neatly into an existing worldview. Protests against ICE were already seen by many as an attack on law enforcement and national sovereignty. Casting them as orchestrated rather than organic reinforced the belief that opposition is manufactured by political elites. In that telling, Trump wasn't threatening democracy, but defending it against sabotage. Language becomes armor when people already feel under siege. But for others, especially in Minnesota, the comments felt like a line being crossed. The idea that a president would publicly single out state officials over protest management raised uncomfortable questions. Is this about maintaining order, or about asserting dominance over states that refuse to play along? Does strong rhetoric deter unrest, or does it inflame it by turning local disputes into national showdowns? Those questions don't have simple answers, which is precisely why they linger. Tim Walz, Minnesota's governor, stepped into that space with a markedly different tone. Instead of matching Trump's intensity, he labeled the president's comments as theater, suggesting performance rather than purpose. Calling something theater is a subtle insult, because it implies emptiness behind the noise. Walz framed Minnesota as unwilling to be dragged into a spectacle that benefits national politics more than local stability. In doing so, he positioned himself as a steward of calm rather than a participant in escalation. That response wasn't accidental. Walz understands the asymmetry of attention between a president and a governor. If he shouts, he amplifies Trump's narrative. If he stays measured, he creates contrast. By emphasizing state autonomy and local decision-making, he appealed to a different set of values. Federal power versus state judgment has always been fertile ground in American politics. The clash quickly became symbolic, almost archetypal. Trump represented centralized authority, border enforcement, and the language of crackdown. Walz represented decentralization, state rights, and the language of restraint. Neither explicitly accused the other of wrongdoing, but both implied that the other was acting irresponsibly. Implication is often safer than accusation, especially when cameras are rolling. Media coverage leaned into the contrast. Headlines framed it as a White House versus Minnesota showdown, simplifying a messy reality into a digestible duel. Cable panels debated whether Trump was enforcing order or undermining federalism. Others asked whether Walz was defending democratic norms or enabling disorder. The actual protests became almost incidental to the larger narrative. What's often lost in these moments is how layered protest movements really are. Crowds rarely move with a single purpose or leader, despite how tempting that story is. Some demonstrators oppose ICE as an institution. Others oppose specific policies. Others are simply expressing solidarity. Lumping them into a single category, professional or otherwise, flattens those distinctions. Flattening, however, is a feature of political messaging, not a bug. Trump's language thrives on flattening. By reducing complex movements into simple labels, he makes them easier to confront rhetorically. That approach energizes supporters who prefer clarity over nuance. It also alienates those who see nuance as essential to legitimacy. The trade-off is deliberate. Walz's counter-message leaned heavily on process. He spoke about Minnesota handling its own affairs, about not being baited into a national narrative. Process, unlike spectacle, rarely goes viral, but it builds credibility over time. His refusal to escalate didn't make the story disappear, but it did change its tone. Tone matters when tension is already high. The presence of Ilhan Omar in Trump's comments added another layer of complexity. As a high-profile representative from Minnesota, she embodies many of the themes Trump regularly targets. Mentioning her alongside the governor broadened the confrontation from executive to legislative leadership. It also ensured the story would resonate far beyond Minnesota's borders. Names carry weight, and Trump knows which ones trigger reaction. Critics argued that invoking deportation or arrest in this context blurred rhetorical boundaries. Supporters countered that strong language is necessary when institutions are under attack. Both sides accused the other of undermining democracy, a familiar refrain in contemporary politics. The word democracy itself becomes a mirror, reflecting whatever meaning the speaker prefers. When everyone claims to defend it, the term loses precision. Walz's insistence that Minnesota would not play along was as much about identity as policy. States pride themselves on distinct political cultures, and Minnesota's is rooted in pragmatism and civic order. By emphasizing that tradition, Walz appealed to voters who value stability over drama. He didn't deny the existence of unrest, but he rejected the premise that it required federal theatrics. That rejection became his quiet form of resistance. Trump's approach, by contrast, treats resistance as evidence of necessity. If states push back, it confirms in his narrative that federal authority is needed. This self-reinforcing loop has defined much of his political style. Every objection becomes proof of obstruction. Every criticism becomes validation. The danger in such loops is that they crowd out resolution. When escalation is rewarded with attention, de-escalation feels like weakness. Walz's challenge was to avoid appearing passive while refusing to amplify the conflict. Trump's challenge was irrelevant because amplification is his currency. The asymmetry shapes the entire exchange. Observers outside the partisan trenches noticed something else. The confrontation revealed how fragile the balance between protest and authority has become. Public demonstrations are increasingly interpreted through national lenses, regardless of local context. Presidential commentary can transform a state issue into a federal spectacle overnight. That transformation is difficult to reverse. At the heart of it all sits a fundamental question. Who gets to define what constitutes legitimate protest versus insurrectionary behavior? Is that determination made by scale, by intent, by disruption, or by political convenience? The answers shift depending on who is speaking, and when answers shift, trust erodes. Trump's rhetoric suggests a low tolerance for ambiguity. In his framing, disorder has authors, and those authors must be named. Walz's rhetoric suggests a higher tolerance, or at least a belief that ambiguity should be managed locally. Neither position is inherently absurd, but they collide in practice. That collision is what the public ends up watching. As days passed, the story settled into familiar grooves. Trump doubled down through surrogates and sympathetic outlets. Walz reiterated his refusal to engage in what he called political games. Each repetition hardened their respective positions. Movement in such standoffs is rare. What remains unresolved is whether anyone benefits from the escalation. Does calling protesters professionals discourage unrest, or does it delegitimize genuine grievances? Does dismissing presidential comments as theater reduce tension, or does it invite further provocation? The answers depend on what one believes motivates crowds and leaders alike. Belief, not evidence, often drives these debates. By the end of the week, the protests themselves had largely receded from headlines. What persisted was the image of a president and a governor talking past each other. One spoke the language of national authority and warnings. The other spoke the language of local control and restraint. Between them, the public was left to decide which language felt more trustworthy. As the exchange continued to ripple outward, it became clear that neither side was actually talking to the other. Trump was speaking past Minnesota, aiming instead at a national audience primed to see immigration as the defining test of order. Walz was speaking past the White House, addressing residents who wanted reassurance that their state wouldn't become a pawn. Both messages could coexist without intersecting, which is often how political standoffs persist. When communication becomes parallel rather than direct, what's striking is how quickly language hardens into identity. Calling protesters professional does more than question motives. It redraws the boundary between citizen and actor. Walz's "if each framing carries risk." Trump's risks alienating those who believe protest is a legitimate pressure valve in a democracy. Walz risks appearing dismissive to those who feel genuinely threatened by disorder. Neither risk is fatal on its own, but both accumulate over time. Accumulation is how political capital erodes. The federal-state tension underlying this clash isn't new, but it feels newly brittle. Immigration enforcement sits at the fault line, where national policy meets local consequence. States bear the immediate impact of raids. Presidents, meanwhile, bear the symbolic burden of border control, regardless of local nuance. When symbols collide with lived reality, friction is inevitable. Trump's approach treats friction as leverage. By escalating rhetorically, he forces state leaders to choose between compliance and confrontation. Either choice reinforces his narrative of decisive leadership. Walz's approach treats friction as something to be dampened before it ignites. That difference in strategy says as much about media dynamics, further complicate the picture. Short clips reward intensity over explanation, and Trump's statements are built for that economy. Walz's calmer rebuttals require context, which travels more slowly. In the attention market, speed often beats substance. That imbalance shapes which version of events people encounter first. Some commentators suggested the clash was inevitable in an election-adjacent climate. Every protest becomes a potential campaign ad. Every response, a positioning statement. Trump's words sounded to critics like an opening salvo, not a closing argument. Walz's words sounded to supporters like a firewall against national overreach. Both interpretations assume strategy, even when emotion may be driving events. Emotion is the invisible engine here. Fear of chaos, fear of losing control, fear of being ignored. Trump's language channels fear into certainty, offering a clear villain and a clear posture. Walz's language channels fear into reassurance, promising stability and local competence. Different fears demand different comforts. There's also the question of precedent, even if no one uses the word explicitly. What happens when a president publicly pressures a state over protest management? What happens when a governor publicly refuses to engage on those terms? The answers aren't written down anywhere, but they're being rehearsed in real time. Rehearsals matter because they inform future scripts. Observers who step back from the noise notice how much this resembles earlier cycles. A national leader frames unrest as existential. A local leader frames the national response as intrusive. Supporters on both sides harden, while moderates search for off-ramps. Those off-ramps are rarely highlighted. Trump's critics argue that such rhetoric risks normalizing extraordinary language. Once arrest or expulsion is mentioned, even hypothetically, the bar shifts. Supporters respond that extraordinary times demand extraordinary clarity. Both sides claim to be reacting to the other's excess. The loop tightens. Walz's insistence on keeping Minnesota out of the game is telling. Games have winners and losers, and governance isn't supposed to. By rejecting the frame, he tries to deprive it of oxygen. Whether that works depends on how long the national spotlight lingers. Spotlights are hard to dim once they're on. As days turn into weeks, practical governance resumes beneath the rhetoric. Protests ebb and flow. Law enforcement adjusts. Communities adapt. None of that makes headlines the way presidential statements do. Normalcy returns quietly, without ceremony. Quiet outcomes rarely satisfy loud debates. What the public ultimately takes away may be less about immigration and more about tone. Who sounded credible? Who sounded reckless? Who sounded steady? These impressions settle slowly, often below conscious awareness. They influence trust more than policy details ever could. Trust, once shifted, is difficult to reset. Trump will likely continue to frame opposition as coordinated and elite-driven. That frame resonates with those who feel their concerns are dismissed by institutions. Walz will likely continue to emphasize local authority and calm administration. That frame resonates with those who fear national politics swallowing everyday life. Neither frame fully captures reality, but both capture sentiment. In the end, this confrontation may be remembered less for what was said than for what it revealed. It revealed how quickly protest becomes politicized at the highest level. It revealed how state leaders navigate pressure without amplifying it. It revealed how language itself can escalate or contain tension. And it revealed how divided expectations of leadership have become. The clash between Donald Trump and Tim Walz doesn't resolve the immigration debate. It doesn't settle questions about protest or authority. What it does is crystallize a moment where power spoke loudly and restraint spoke back. Which voice people trust more will shape future conflicts like this one. The argument moves on, but the lesson lingers. As the confrontation drags on, what becomes clearer is that the fight is less about Minnesota than about control of the story. Trump's instinct is to dominate the frame before anyone else can define it, because whoever names the problem usually gets to prescribe the response. Walz's instinct is the opposite, to shrink the frame until it fits inside state borders and loses its national charge. These instincts collide not because either man misunderstands the other, but because each understands his own incentives perfectly. The clash is strategic, even when it feels emotional. Trump's language around immigration has always relied on sharp edges. Sharp edges cut through noise, but they also leave marks that linger longer than the original statement. Calling protesters professionals implies planning, coordination, and outside influence without ever having to prove it. It invites supporters to connect dots on their own, which is often more powerful than being handed conclusions. Ambiguity, when weaponized, does much of the work quietly. Walz counters with a different kind of ambiguity. By calling the president's rhetoric theater, he questions intent without questioning authority outright. He doesn't deny federal power. He questions how it's being used in this moment. That distinction allows him to sound respectful while still resisting the frame. Respectful resistance is harder to caricature, but also harder to mobilize. This difference in mobilization matters because modern politics runs on energy. Trump's base feeds on confrontation and sees escalation as proof of authenticity. Walz's coalition is more fragmented, valuing stability, but wary of appearing passive. Keeping that coalition aligned requires careful calibration, not grand gestures. Calibration rarely goes viral, but it sustains governance. The Minnesota protests themselves become almost ghost-like in this process. They are referenced constantly but examined rarely. Who was there? What they wanted? How they organized? All become secondary to how they're described. Description replaces observation, and repetition replaces inquiry. That substitution is one of the quiet dangers of politicized protest. Trump's framing turns protest into a question of loyalty. Are you with enforcement, or are you enabling chaos? The simplicity of that question is its strength and its weakness. It forces alignment, but discourages nuance. Nuance, in moments of fear, is often seen as indecision. Walz's framing turns protest into a management problem. How do you maintain order without inflaming tensions? How do you protect rights while ensuring safety? These are slow questions with slow answers. They don't lend themselves to slogans. Media ecosystems amplify whichever framing travels faster. In this case, speed favors confrontation. A presidential quote outpaces a gubernatorial press conference every time. That imbalance shapes public perception before facts can catch up. By the time context arrives, impressions have already settled. Some commentators suggest Trump's comments were designed less to resolve unrest and more to provoke response. A response, any response, confirms relevance. Walz's attempt to deny that response is therefore a form of resistance in itself. But resistance through denial risks being read as avoidance. Avoidance and restraint can look identical from a distance. The idea of arresting or deporting political figures, even floated rhetorically, carries symbolic weight. Symbols matter because they reset what feels sayable. Once extreme language enters the discourse, the center shifts. Future statements are measured against the new baseline. Normalization happens quietly, one comparison at a time. Supporters of Trump argue that critics overreact to words. They point out that no legal action followed, that rhetoric is not reality. Critics respond that rhetoric shapes reality long before laws do. Both positions have precedent, which is why neither side convinces the other. The debate becomes circular, feeding itself. Walz's emphasis on Minnesota not playing the game suggests awareness of that cycle. Games have rules designed to produce winners, not solutions. By rejecting the premise, he tries to step outside the loop. Whether anyone follows him, there is another matter. Leadership sometimes means choosing a quieter battlefield. The federal-state dynamic complicates everything further. Immigration enforcement is federal, but its consequences are local. Protests erupt where people live, not where policies are written. States absorb the social shockwaves regardless of who authored the rules. That imbalance fuels resentment on both sides. Trump's rhetoric appeals to those who see federal authority as the only force capable of imposing order. Walz's rhetoric appeals to those who fear that same authority becoming indifferent to local context. These fears are not mutually exclusive, but politics treats them as such. By framing them as opposites, leaders simplify choices for voters. Simplification is politically useful, even when it distorts reality. As the confrontation stretches on, it becomes clear that neither side expects persuasion. The goal is consolidation, not conversion. Trump consolidates by reinforcing an image of strength under siege. Walz consolidates by reinforcing an image of steadiness under pressure. Both images serve their respective futures. Election calendars hover silently in the background. Every statement is weighed for how it might echo months later. Trump's comments energize supporters who see immigration as the defining issue. Walz's responses reassure moderates uneasy with national volatility. Neither camp is speaking to the other's priorities. Public fatigue is the unspoken third party in this standoff. Many Americans are tired of constant escalation. They want problems managed, not dramatized. Yet drama dominates attention, crowding out management. Fatigue breeds disengagement, which alters the political landscape subtly but significantly. The confrontation also exposes how blurred the line between protest and threat has become. Peaceful demonstrations are increasingly discussed in the language of security. Security language carries assumptions that aren't easily walked back. Once framed as threat, dissent becomes suspect by default. That shift worries civil libertarians across the spectrum. Walz's insistence on local handling can be read as an attempt to preserve that line. By keeping protests within a governance framework rather than a security one, he limits escalation. Trump's insistence on federal framing does the opposite. Neither approach is neutral. Both reflect priorities. The difference lies in which risks each is willing to accept. As days pass, new stories compete for attention. But this one doesn't fully disappear. It becomes a reference point in future debates about protest and authority. Commentators cite it as an example of overreach or restraint, depending on their lens. The original details blur, leaving behind an impression. Impressions are harder to challenge than facts. There is also an international audience watching, whether acknowledged or not. How a country handles protest signals something about its democratic confidence. Strong rhetoric can project control, but also insecurity. Measured responses can project stability, but also weakness. Perception abroad mirrors division at home. Trump's political style thrives on stark contrasts. Order versus chaos. Loyalty versus betrayal. Strength versus softness. These binaries leave little room for middle ground. Walz's style, by contrast, relies on gradients rather than binaries. Gradients are harder to defend in polarized environments. As analysts dissect the clash, some note how predictable it all feels. The script is familiar even when the cast changes. A national figure escalates, a local figure resists, media amplifies, public divides. The cycle repeats with minor variations. Familiarity dulls shock, but deepens cynicism. Yet cynicism doesn't stop participation. It reshapes it. People engage not to solve problems, but to affirm identity. Trump's supporters rally around defiance. Walz's supporters rally around moderation. Identity politics thrives even when policy stalls. In quieter moments, the question returns to outcomes. Did the rhetoric reduce unrest or inflame it? Did restraint calm tensions or merely delay them? These questions lack clear metrics. Without metrics, narratives fill the gap. The confrontation ultimately reveals competing philosophies of leadership. One views pressure as a tool to force alignment. The other views pressure as something to absorb and dissipate. Both have historical precedent. Both carry risk. As the story fades from front pages, its lessons remain unresolved. Future protests will test which approach resonates more. Future leaders will study this exchange for cues. They will ask not who was right, but who benefited. Benefit, in politics, often outweighs correctness. What lingers most is the sense that language itself has become a battleground. Words now carry consequences independent of action. Calling something insurrectionary or theatrical reshapes expectations instantly. Once reshaped, expectations are hard to reset. The fight over meaning outlasts the fight over events. Trump and Walz will move on to other issues. Their clash over Minnesota will become part of their broader narratives. Supporters will remember it as confirmation of what they already believed. Critics will remember it as warning or reassurance. Memory, like politics, is selective. In the end, this confrontation says less about immigration than about trust. Trust in federal authority. Trust in state governance. Trust in rhetoric itself. When trust erodes, every statement is read for hidden intent. Hidden intent becomes the default assumption. That assumption shapes the future more than any single policy decision. As the conversation stretches further, it becomes harder to ignore how much of this dispute is really about who gets to define normal. Trump's language pushes the boundary of what sounds acceptable from a president, and then waits to see who pushes back. Walz's response, by contrast, tries to pull that boundary back toward routine governance, where protests are problems to be managed, not enemies to be named. Neither move is accidental, and neither is purely reactive. They are competing bids to set the baseline for what Americans should expect from leadership. What makes the moment especially charged is that immigration has become a stand-in for broader anxieties. It's not just about enforcement or borders, but about who belongs, who decides, and whose voice counts when crowds gather. Trump's rhetoric compresses those anxieties into a single posture of control. Walz's rhetoric disperses them into administrative responsibility and local judgment. Compression travels faster, but dispersion lasts longer. There's also a generational undertone that rarely gets named outright. Trump speaks to an audience that remembers a time when federal authority felt unchallenged and decisive. Walz speaks to an audience that has grown up amid decentralization and mistrust of centralized power. These audiences overlap, but their instincts differ. The clash exposes those instincts without resolving them. Critics of Trump argue that his framing risks turning protest into a loyalty test. Once dissent is described as professionalized or orchestrated, ordinary participation becomes suspect. Supporters respond that failing to draw hard lines invites chaos. Both sides are arguing about prevention, not punishment. Prevention, however, is where definitions do the most work. Walz's insistence on not playing along with the spectacle reads, to some, as quiet strength. To others, it reads as an evasion of responsibility. That ambiguity is unavoidable when leaders choose restraint in a media environment that rewards intensity. Restraint relies on trust that audiences will see the value in not escalating. That trust is increasingly scarce. The role of Ilhan Omar in the rhetoric adds another layer. even when she is not the focus. Her presence in Trump's remarks signals continuity with earlier national battles. It reminds audiences that Minnesota is not just a place, but a symbol in the immigration debate. Symbols simplify geography into ideology. Once simplified, geography becomes interchangeable. Some observers worry that this interchangeability erases local context entirely. Protests in Minneapolis are not the same as protests elsewhere, even if they share slogans, local histories, relationships with law enforcement, and community dynamics matter. National rhetoric flattens those differences for convenience. Convenience, again, competes with accuracy. Trump's supporters argue that flattening is necessary to confront systemic problems. They see local nuance as an excuse for inaction. Walz's supporters argue that ignoring nuance creates new problems faster than it solves old ones. They see national pressure as a blunt instrument. The disagreement is philosophical, not just political. Media narratives magnify this philosophical split. Panels debate tone more than substance because tone is easier to judge. Who sounded firm? Who sounded reckless? Who sounded calm? These judgments settle into shorthand assessments. Shorthand shapes memory. As the story recedes, it leaves behind a template for future clashes. Presidents may feel emboldened to comment aggressively on state-level unrest. Governors may feel compelled to publicly assert autonomy to avoid being subsumed. Each move anticipates the other. Anticipation hardens behavior. The risk is that every protest becomes a rehearsal for confrontation rather than an opportunity for resolution. If leaders expect escalation, they prepare language instead of solutions. If audiences expect spectacle, they reward it with attention. The feedback loop tightens. Breaking it requires incentives that currently don't exist. Walz's approach hints at an alternative, however fragile. By emphasizing governance over performance, he tries to redirect focus to outcomes. Outcomes, unfortunately, are slow and unglamorous. They don't fit neatly into a clip. Clips still dominate the conversation. Trump's approach, conversely, accepts that reality and exploits it. He speaks in sentences designed to be repeated, debated, and condemned. Condemnation keeps him central. Centrality is power in a media-saturated environment. Whether that power translates into policy is secondary. The public response reflects this divide. Some people feel reassured by Trump's certainty, even if they question his methods. Others feel reassured by Walz's steadiness, even if they question his effectiveness. Reassurance is a psychological need, not a policy outcome. Leaders who meet that need gain loyalty. As weeks pass, practical questions remain unanswered. How should states coordinate with federal agencies during protests tied to federal policy? Where is the line between assistance and interference? What language reduces tension rather than amplifies it? These questions require collaboration, not confrontation. Yet collaboration doesn't generate the same political returns. It lacks the drama that mobilizes supporters. It produces shared credit rather than individual acclaim. Incentives favor conflict. Conflict becomes normalized. The Minnesota episode illustrates how easily rhetoric can outrun reality. Words spoken in Washington ripple outward, reshaping local debates overnight. Local responses are then judged against national expectations. This inversion of scale is new, or at least newly visible. Visibility changes behavior. Trump and Walz will both claim consistency. Trump will say he stood firm against disorder. Walz will say he protected Minnesota from unnecessary escalation. Both claims can coexist. Coexistence doesn't equal agreement. What lingers for observers is a sense of fragility. Not fragility of law, but fragility of norms. Norms depend on shared assumptions about language and limits. When those assumptions diverge, norms wobble. Wobbling norms invite testing. Future leaders will study this moment for lessons. They will ask which approach drew less backlash and more support. They will note how quickly national rhetoric can overshadow local action. They will adjust accordingly. Adjustment, not reflection, often drives politics. The protests themselves, stripped of symbolism, were expressions of fear, anger, and conviction. Those emotions don't vanish because leaders argue over them. They resurface in new forms, in new places. How leaders respond sets patterns that echo. Echoes last longer than events. As the cycle moves on, the confrontation becomes part of a larger story about authority and dissent. Trump and Walz occupy opposing poles in that story. Their clash doesn't resolve the tension, it clarifies it. Clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, has value. Whether it leads to better outcomes remains an open question. In the end, this episode underscores a simple reality. Leadership today is as much about managing narratives as managing people. Trump manages by sharpening conflict. Walz manages by dulling it. The country watches, weighing which approach feels safer in uncertain times.